The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the small bridge of my survey ship, and my claws locked onto the edge of my seat. A signal, a distress signal, coming from beyond the quarantine line. My name is Vesk, and I am a xenobiologist of the Thren Concord. Until that moment, my life had been simple. I studied dead worlds and broken ecosystems. I filed reports. I went home. I had never once expected to hear a signal from the other side of that line, because nothing was supposed to be there. Nothing, except the stories. Every hatchling in the Concord grows up hearing about the burning world. Our elders whisper it like a warning, not a history lesson. They speak of a species that never learned to stop fighting. A species that kept moving forward, even when logic screamed for them to retreat. A species we simply call humans. I never believed the stories were literal. I assumed, like most educated Thren, that the tale had grown taller with every generation that repeated it. Wars always sound worse in memory than they were in truth. That is what I told myself as a child, lying in the dark, listening to my grandmother describe a battle where a single human ship refused to surrender, even after its hull had been torn open 3 times. I told myself the same thing as an adult. Right up until the moment my ship's sensors locked onto a wreck, drifting silently in the black, just past the line no Concord vessel was supposed to cross without direct orders from the High Assembly. My superior, a broad-shouldered Thren named Threll, appeared on my comm screen almost immediately. His voice was tight, controlled, the way it always was when he was trying not to sound afraid. "Vesk," he said, "we have received authorization to investigate. You have been selected because of your medical training. I want you to understand what you are walking into. This is human territory." I remember my throat tightening at those words. Human territory. Not a myth, not a nursery tale. A real border, with a real distress signal coming from just beyond it. I asked him what we were supposed to do if the stories were true. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. He told me the Concord did not know. No one alive had spoken to a living human. All we had were old records, old fears, and one battle fought centuries ago that ended so badly it convinced an entire alliance of species to draw a line across the galaxy and never cross it again. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my small cabin and stared at the ceiling, running through everything I had ever learned about humans. Their homeworld was called Earth. Their war with the Concord had lasted only a handful of years, but the damage they caused in that short time was still spoken of in hushed tones. Entire fleets destroyed. Entire strategies rendered useless. Our ancestors had faced enemies before, slow and predictable and rational. Humans were none of those things, according to the old accounts. They were said to fight without limits, without mercy, without any regard for their own survival, as long as it meant hurting whoever stood against them. I remember thinking, as I finally drifted toward sleep, that I was about to meet a monster. The following morning, my ship approached the wreck. It was a freighter, large and utilitarian, its hull scarred with deep burns and cracked plating. Whatever had happened to it had happened recently. Sparks still drifted from a ruptured section near the engines, extinguishing themselves silently in the vacuum. My sensors detected life signs, several of them, weak but present. Threll's voice came through my comm again, quieter this time. "Proceed with extreme caution. If anything goes wrong, you signal immediately, and we pull you out." I remember nodding, even though he could not see me do it. My hands were steady on the controls, but my mind was anything but steady. I told myself I was a scientist. I told myself I was there to observe, to document, to understand. I told myself fear had no place in careful observation. None of that stopped my hearts from pounding as I guided my shuttle toward the airlock of the human ship. The connection sealed with a soft hiss. I stood at the threshold for several seconds, staring at the door that separated me from something my entire species had been taught to fear since before I was born. My hand hovered over the release control. I thought about turning back. I thought about signaling Threll and telling him I could not do this. Instead, I pressed the release. The door slid open, and the first thing that struck me was the smell. Burnt metal, and something else beneath it. Something warm and human that I had no name for yet. The second thing that struck me was the silence. I had expected shouting, or violence, or the chaos my grandmother's stories always described. Instead, I found quiet, careful movement. A woman knelt beside another crew member on the floor. pressing a strip of cloth against a wound on his side. Her hands moved with practiced speed, without panic, without wasted motion. She glanced up at me for only a moment. Her eyes were tired, rimmed with exhaustion, but there was no fear in them, no anger either, just a flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by focus, as she returned her attention to the injured man beneath her hands. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to make sense of what I was seeing. This was not the monster my grandmother had warned me about. This was someone working to save a life. Another figure approached from further down the corridor, a man with short dark hair, and a jacket streaked with soot. He held up both hands slowly, palms open, the universal gesture of peace among most species I had studied. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and even. "We are not here to fight you," he said. "We need help. Our engine core is failing, and we have wounded." I remember trying to speak and finding that my throat had gone dry. I managed to introduce myself, my voice smaller than I intended. I told him I was a medical officer, that I could help, if he would let me. He studied me for a moment, the way I imagine a person studies something unfamiliar and possibly dangerous. Then he nodded, and stepped aside to let me pass. His name, he told me, was Daniel. The woman treating the wounded man was named Grace. As I moved further into the ship, I saw more of the crew, exhausted, injured, some clearly frightened, yet every single one of them working together with quiet determination instead of falling apart. I knelt beside Grace and offered my assistance. She hesitated only a second before handing me a container of medical supplies, guiding my hands toward the wound with quick, clear instructions. Her voice never wavered, even as the man beneath her hands groaned in pain. She spoke to him gently between instructions to me, telling him he was going to be fine, that he needed to stay still, that help had arrived. I worked beside her for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. Slowly, the wound stabilized. The man's breathing steadied. Grace sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, and for the first time, she smiled at me. It was small and tired, but it was real.
"Thank you,"
she said. I did not know how to respond. Every instinct I had been raised with told me this should not be happening. The monsters from my childhood stories were not supposed to thank me. They were not supposed to work beside me to save a life. They were not supposed to look at me with anything other than hatred. Daniel returned a short while later, crouching down beside us to check on his crewmate. He asked Grace for a status update, listened carefully to her answer, and then turned to me. "Why did you come here?" he asked. Not with suspicion, but with genuine curiosity. I told him the truth. I told him we received his distress signal and were ordered to investigate. I told him I expected to find danger, not people in need of help. He was quiet for a moment, considering my words. Then he said something I would remember for the rest of my life. People are usually more complicated than the stories told about them. I did not have an answer for that. I only nodded, and continued working, my mind spinning with questions I had never expected to ask. If the stories about humans were wrong, or at least incomplete, what else had I been taught that was not entirely true? And if this crew, exhausted and wounded and stranded far from any help, could still choose calm over chaos, kindness over cruelty, what did that say about the species my people had feared for so long? I did not have answers yet. I only had the quiet hum of the failing ship around me, the steady breathing of a man whose life we had just saved, and the unsettling realization that everything I thought I knew about humans was about to be tested, piece by piece, in ways I could not yet imagine. Little did I know, the true test had not even begun. The injured man's name was Owen, and once his breathing steadied, Grace allowed herself a moment to rest. She sat against the wall of the corridor, knees drawn up, eyes closed, and for the first time since I had boarded the ship, I saw exhaustion win against her discipline. It lasted only seconds. Then she opened her eyes again, checked on Owen once more, and rose to help another crew member carry supplies toward the engine room. I followed Daniel deeper into the ship, past cracked panels and flickering lights, toward the source of the failure. He explained as we walked that a debris field had struck them without warning 3 days earlier. Their navigation systems had been damaged, their long-range communication crippled, and their engine core pushed past safe limits trying to keep life support running for the whole crew. They had been drifting ever since, sending out a weak distress signal and hoping someone, anyone, would hear it before their air ran out. I asked him why they had not simply diverted more power to the signal, since a stronger call would have reached help faster. He looked at me for a moment before answering. Because life support mattered more, he said. A weak signal that keeps everyone breathing is worth more than a strong one that does not. It was such a simple answer, yet it unsettled me more than anything else he had said. Every choice this crew made seemed to follow the same quiet logic. Protect the living first. Worry about being found second. It was not the reckless, chaotic behavior my people had been taught to expect. It was controlled, deliberate, and entirely focused on keeping each other alive. We reached the engine room to find a young woman named Mara wedged half inside an open panel, her arms buried in a tangle of wiring, muttering instructions to herself under her breath. She barely glanced up when we entered, too focused on the task in front of her to spare more than a passing acknowledgement. Core temperature is climbing again, she said, mostly to Daniel. I can buy us maybe 2 more hours before it shuts down completely, and I do not know what happens after that. Daniel knelt beside her, asking quick, practical questions about pressure levels and coolant flow. I stood back and watched the two of them work, struck by how naturally they fell into rhythm with each other, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's next move without needing to ask. I offered to contact my ship and request additional engineering support. Daniel hesitated before agreeing, and I understood why. Trusting a Concorde vessel with access to their failing ship was not a small thing, not given the history between our peoples. Yet he nodded anyway, choosing to trust me over the alternative of watching his crew slowly run out of options. I called Threll and explained the situation. His voice was hesitant when he agreed to send additional support, and I could hear the concern behind his careful, measured tone. He warned me again to be cautious, to trust nothing, to remember what the old records said about this species. I told him I would remember. I did not tell him how much those old records already felt incomplete. While we waited for support to arrive, I spent time moving through the ship, offering what medical assistance I could to the rest of the crew. Most of the injuries were minor, cuts and bruises from the initial impact, though a few crew members carried deeper wounds they had been quietly enduring, while focusing their energy on keeping the ship functional, instead of on themselves. One young man, barely more than a boy by human standards, sat alone near a cracked viewport, staring out at the stars with a look of quiet fear on his face. I approached carefully, unsure whether my presence would be welcome. He glanced at me, startled, then offered a small, uncertain smile. I did not expect Concorde to help us, he admitted. Everyone always said you would leave us to die out here. I asked him who told him that. Everyone, he said simply. It is what we grew up hearing, that the Concorde fears us, and fear makes people cruel. His words struck something deep and uncomfortable inside me. I had grown up hearing that humans were monsters, violent and uncontrollable, waiting for any excuse to destroy anyone who crossed their path. He had grown up hearing that my people feared them so deeply, we would rather let them die than offer help. Two different stories, built from the same old war, twisted into fear on both sides. I told him I did not know what stories he had been told, but I could not leave someone to suffer when I had the ability to help. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though testing whether my words matched my actions. They did. I stayed beside him until the worst of his fear eased, until his shoulders relaxed, and his breathing steadied, and by the time I moved on to check on the rest of the crew, he had begun to speak with something closer to trust than suspicion. Hours passed. My reinforcements arrived, a small team of Thren engineers sent to assist with the failing core. I watched carefully as they worked alongside Mara and the rest of the human crew, tension high at first, neither side quite trusting the other, yet slowly softening, as shared effort replaced shared fear. By the time the core stabilized, laughter had even begun to break out between the two crews, quiet and uncertain, but real. Daniel found me near the end of it all, standing near the same viewport where I had spoken with the young crewman earlier. He thanked me again, more formally this time, for the help my people had provided. I told him it was simply the right thing to do. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. "You are surprised by us," he said. It was not a question. I admitted that I was. I told him everything I had been taught about his species suggested chaos and violence, not calm cooperation and quiet sacrifice. He was quiet for a while before answering. "We are not always calm," he said. "There are times when we fight harder than anyone expects, when we refuse to stop, even when stopping would be the easier choice. But that is not because we enjoy violence. It is because we refuse to let go of the people or the things we care about, no matter the cost. I asked him what that meant, exactly, and he hesitated before answering, as though deciding how much to share with someone from a species that had once been his people's enemy. There was a battle, long ago, he said finally. Before the quarantine line existed, a colony of ours was under attack, and the alliance your Concord led at the time decided the colony could not be saved. They pulled their forces back and left it behind. We did not. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I listened. I had heard fragments of this history before, buried in old Concord records, framed always as an example of human recklessness rather than human loyalty. We fought because retreating meant abandoning people who were still alive, still fighting, still hoping someone would come for them, he continued. Your alliance called it madness. We called it refusing to leave anyone behind. I did not know how to respond. Every story I had grown up with painted that battle as proof of human savagery, evidence that they could not be reasoned with, evidence that they fought without limits or sense. I had never once considered that it might have been born from something as simple and as painfully understandable as refusing to give up on people they loved. I told Daniel I was sorry. Sorry for the stories, sorry for the fear, sorry for not questioning any of it sooner. He accepted my apology quietly, without bitterness, and told me that understanding, even late, still mattered. As the last of the repairs finished, and the freighter's engines hummed back to life, steady and strong, I found myself looking at the crew around me with entirely new eyes. These were not monsters, they were people, exhausted and frightened and far from home, who had spent every moment since their ship was damaged, focused entirely on keeping each other alive. I did not yet know how deeply that same devotion would soon be tested. I did not know that the calm I had witnessed, the careful discipline and quiet cooperation, was only one side of what this crew was capable of. I would not have to wait long to see the other side. Somewhere beyond the edge of my sensors, unseen and unheard, something far more dangerous than old fears between two former enemies was already closing in. With the freighter's engines repaired and the wounded stabilized, Daniel invited me to remain aboard while final checks were completed, and I agreed without hesitation. Something had shifted in me since boarding that ship. I no longer saw an assignment to complete, or a mystery to solve. I saw people I wanted to understand, and perhaps, if I was honest with myself, people I had already begun to care about. Grace found me in the small mess hall a while later, carrying 2 cups of something warm and dark that smelled faintly bitter. She handed one to me, without asking whether I wanted it, and settled into the seat across from me with the easy familiarity of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was no longer a stranger. You handled yourself well back there, she said, nodding toward the corridor where Owen still rested. Most people freeze the first time they see a wound like that. I told her I had studied medicine for many years, though nothing had quite prepared me for the reality of it. She laughed softly at that, a warm, tired sound, and told me nothing ever truly prepares anyone for the reality of anything. You simply learn as you go, she said, and try not to make the same mistake twice. I asked her something that had been sitting uneasily in my mind since my conversation with Daniel. I asked her about the old war, about the battle he had described, about the colony her people had refused to abandon, even when logic argued against it. Her expression grew distant for a moment, the warmth fading into something quieter and more serious. That story gets told differently depending on who is telling it, she said. Your people remember it as the moment humans became dangerous. We remember it as the moment we learned no one else would come for us if things went wrong, so we had better be prepared to come for each other. I asked her if she believed the fighting had been worth it. She considered the question carefully before answering. I do not think anyone who lived through it would call it worth it, she said. Too many people died. But I understand why it happened. When someone you love is trapped and dying, and the only thing standing between them and safety is your willingness to keep fighting, most people find reasons to keep fighting. I sat with her words for a long while, turning them over in my mind. I thought of my grandmother's stories, the ones that painted humans as creatures without limits, without reason, without anything resembling the quiet loyalty I had witnessed firsthand over the past several hours. Those stories had never mentioned love. They had never mentioned loss, or grief, or the desperate refusal to abandon people who still had a chance to be saved. I asked Grace how the war had ended. Badly, for everyone, she said. Both sides lost more than they gained. Eventually the fighting stopped, not because either side surrendered, but because both sides realized continuing would destroy everything worth protecting in the first place. The quarantine line was drawn soon after. Neither side trusted the other enough to risk contact again. I told her that history, the version I had been taught, painted the quarantine line as protection for the rest of the galaxy against human aggression, not as a mutual agreement born from exhaustion and grief on both sides. She smiled sadly at that. History usually gets written by whoever survives long enough to write it, she said, and even then, it rarely tells the whole truth. Daniel joined us a short while later, along with Mara, who still had faint smudges of engine grease across her hands, despite clearly having tried to wash them away. The four of us sat together in that small mess hall, sharing quiet conversation that had nothing to do with survival, or repairs, or old wars. Mara told stories about growing up on a small farming colony, about learning to fix machines before she learned to properly read. Daniel spoke about his early years training as a pilot, about the friends he had lost along the way, about the weight of responsibility that came with commanding a crew who trusted him with their lives. I found myself sharing stories of my own. I told them about growing up in the Concord, about the rigid structure of Thren's society, about the quiet expectation that every citizen serve a purpose deemed useful by the collective. I told them how different this felt, sitting among people who spoke so openly about fear and loss and hope, without shame, without hesitation. Daniel listened carefully to everything I said, and when I finished, he told me something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. Maybe the biggest difference between us is not how we fight, he said. Maybe it is how we let ourselves feel things. Your people learned to hide fear behind structure. We learned to lean on each other instead of hiding. I did not have an answer for that. I only nodded, feeling something shift deep inside me, some old, rigid belief slowly beginning to crack apart and rebuild itself into something new. Our conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the ship's bridge, a routine sensor alert that Mara initially dismissed as background noise from the still recovering systems. She rose to check it anyway, muttering something about being careful after everything they had already been through. I remember watching her walk toward the bridge, unaware that the moment she stepped through that door, everything about our quiet evening would change. A sharp, urgent alarm rang out only seconds later, cutting through the calm atmosphere of the mess hall like a blade. Daniel was on his feet instantly, his relaxed posture replaced by something sharp and alert. Grace followed just as quickly, her earlier exhaustion nowhere to be seen. I hurried after them toward the bridge, my heart's pounding with a fear I had almost forgotten during the past several hours of quiet conversation. Mara stood at the main console, her face pale, her hands moving rapidly across the controls. "Unknown contacts," she said, her voice tight. "Multiple ships, closing fast. They are not responding to any hailing frequency." Daniel leaned over her shoulder, studying the readings with narrowed eyes. "How many?" he asked. "At least 6, she answered. "Maybe more. Sensors are having trouble getting a clean read through the debris field." I asked what kind of ships they were, though something in my chest already told me the answer would not be reassuring. Mara adjusted the sensor array, and an image slowly resolved on the main display. The vessels were sleek, angular, built for speed and aggression, rather than trade or exploration. I recognized the design immediately from old Concord threat assessments, vessels belonging to a species known only by the fear they inspired across dozens of star systems. "Raiders," I said quietly, the word feeling heavier than I expected as it left my mouth. Daniel's expression hardened. "That explains why they are not responding," he said. "They are not here to talk." I told him my ship could contact the nearest Concord patrol, though I knew even as I said it that any response would take far too long to matter. The freighter's engines, though repaired, were still not operating at full strength. My own survey vessel was small, unarmed, built for scientific observation rather than combat. Neither ship stood any real chance of outrunning 6 aggressive raiders on their own. Grace was already moving toward the medical bay, calling out instructions to the rest of the crew as she went, preparing for the possibility of further injuries. Owen, still weak from his earlier wound, insisted on rising to help despite Grace's protests, and I watched as the crew organized themselves with the same calm, practiced efficiency I had witnessed earlier that day, only now sharpened by urgency instead of exhaustion. I stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by how quickly the mood aboard the ship had shifted from warmth and quiet conversation to focused, controlled tension. Daniel noticed my hesitation and placed a steady hand briefly on my shoulder. "You are safe here," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos building around us. "But I need you to trust me, and trust my crew, over the next few minutes. Can you do that?" I looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of the doubt I felt inside myself, and found none. Only quiet, unshakable resolve. I told him yes. He nodded once, then turned his attention back to the bridge, already calling out orders to Mara, already calculating options and contingencies with the same calm precision I had seen him use while repairing the engine core hours earlier. Something told me this was not the first time he had faced danger like this. Something told me it likely would not be the last. The raider ships grew closer on the display with every passing second, their formation tightening, their intent becoming clearer with each moment that passed without any attempt at communication. My heart pounded painfully in my chest as I realized, with sudden and complete clarity, that the quiet, gentle crew I had spent the past several hours coming to care for was about to show me an entirely different side of themselves. I did not yet know whether that side would frighten me or save me. I only knew, deep down, that I was about to find out. The change in Daniel happened so quickly, it startled me more than the raiders themselves. One moment he stood beside Mara, voice calm and steady, and the next he was moving through the bridge with a sharp, focused energy that seemed to pull the entire crew into perfect coordination around him. "Grace," he called out, "status on the wounded." "Stable, but not fit for movement," she answered from the corridor, her voice carrying clearly despite the growing noise of alarms. "Keep it that way," Daniel said. "Mara, divert everything we have to engines and shields. Weapons stay offline until I say otherwise." I stared at him, confused by the order. I asked why he would leave weapons offline when 6 hostile ships were closing in with clear aggressive intent. "Because firing first confirms exactly what they expect from us," he said, without looking away from the display. "If they think we are an easy target, they press the attack recklessly. If they think we might fight back the moment they get close, they get cautious, and cautious raiders make mistakes." I did not fully understand his reasoning, not then, but I had no time to question it further. The lead raider ship broke formation, angling directly toward the freighter, with clear intent to intercept. Mara's hands flew across her console, rerouting power exactly as instructed, and I felt the ship shudder beneath us as engines pushed harder than they had any right to, given how recently they had been repaired. I asked Daniel what I could do to help. He glanced at me only briefly before answering. "Stay close to Grace," he said. "If this goes the way I think it will, she is going to need every hand she can get." I hurried toward the medical bay, my hearts pounding with a fear that felt different from anything I had experienced before. This was not the quiet, controlled fear I felt boarding an unfamiliar ship. This was sharper, more immediate, fueled by the knowledge that people I had come to care about were now in genuine danger. Grace greeted me with a quick nod, already laying out supplies with practiced efficiency. Owen, despite his injury, sat nearby monitoring a secondary display, relaying information back to the bridge in a steady voice that betrayed none of the exhaustion I knew he must still be feeling. The ship shuddered violently as the first raider vessel opened fire, a warning shot meant to intimidate rather than destroy. Daniel's voice came through the ship's internal calm despite the chaos. "Hold steady," he said. "Let them think they have us." I gripped the edge of a nearby console, steadying myself as the ship rocked again, this time from a shot that struck closer than the first. Grace remained focused entirely on preparing for potential injuries, her hands steady despite the danger surrounding us. I asked her how she managed to stay so calm. "Panic does not save lives," she said simply. "Focus does." The raiders drew closer, their formation tightening around the freighter, clearly believing they had cornered an easy target. I watched on a small display near the medical bay as 3 of the 6 ships broke away, circling toward what I assumed was an attempt to flank us from multiple directions. Then, without warning, everything changed. Now, Daniel's voice rang out through the comm, sharp and commanding. Mara diverted power instantly, shields flaring to full strength as the freighter's weapon systems came online in a burst of coordinated precision. I felt the ship lurch as it executed a sharp, unexpected maneuver, one that placed us directly between two of the flanking raiders, rather than fleeing from them. I did not understand the strategy until Owen explained it quickly to Grace and me, his voice tight with concentration. "He is putting their own ships in each other's line of fire," he said. "If they want to hit us now, they risk hitting each other." I watched in stunned silence as the freighter's weapons fired with precise, controlled bursts, disabling engines and weapon systems on the nearest raider vessels rather than attempting outright destruction. It was not the reckless, chaotic violence my grandmother's stories had described. It was calculated, restrained, focused entirely on neutralizing the threat with the least possible loss of life, even among enemies who had shown no such restraint toward us. Two of the raider ships peeled away entirely, their systems damaged beyond immediate use, retreating rather than risking further engagement. The remaining four regrouped, clearly frustrated by the unexpected resistance, and pressed their attack with renewed aggression. The ship shuddered again, harder this time, and I heard Mara's voice through the comm, tension clear despite her effort to remain steady. "Shields at 60%, she said. "They are targeting our engine section directly." Daniel's response was immediate and calm. "Then we give them a smaller target," he said. I felt the ship twist sharply, engines roaring as Daniel guided us through a maneuver so tight and precise it seemed to defy the very limitations of the freighter's damaged systems. I gripped the console tightly, my body pressed against it by the force of the movement, and yet through it all, I noticed something remarkable. No one aboard that ship panicked. Every voice remained steady. Every action remained deliberate. An alarm blared suddenly from the medical bay itself, and I turned to see Grace's expression shift from focused calm to genuine alarm for the first time since the attack began. "Hull breach," she said quickly. "Lower deck, near the cargo hold." Without hesitation, she moved toward the door, calling instructions over her shoulder to Owen and me to keep monitoring the wounded. I watched her go, my heart's pounding with fear for her safety, and found myself following, despite every rational instinct telling me to remain where it was safer. I caught up to her near the damaged section just as she reached a young crew member trapped beneath a collapsed support beam, the hull breach sealed only by an emergency barrier that would not hold much longer. Grace worked quickly, calling out instructions, and I moved to help without thinking, my earlier fear replaced entirely by the same focused urgency I had witnessed in every human aboard this ship since the moment I arrived. Together, we freed the trapped crew member just as the emergency barrier gave way, venting atmosphere into the damaged section behind a secondary door that sealed automatically to protect the rest of the ship. Grace pulled the injured man clear, and I helped support his weight as we hurried back toward the medical bay, my body trembling from adrenaline I had never experienced so intensely before. By the time we reached safety, the shaking of the ship had begun to ease. Daniel's voice came through the comm once more, quieter now, carrying the exhausted relief of someone who had just guided his people through genuine danger. "They are retreating," he said. "All hostile contacts breaking off." A wave of relief washed over me so powerful, it left me momentarily unsteady on my feet. Grace caught my arm gently, steadying me, and offered a tired, genuine smile. "You did well," she said. I did not feel as though I had done anything remarkable. I had simply done what felt necessary in the moment, the same way every human aboard this ship had done throughout the entire encounter. Yet something about her words settled deeply within me, a quiet sense of belonging I had not expected to feel among people my entire species had been taught to fear. I made my way slowly back toward the bridge, where I found Daniel still seated at the main console, shoulders finally beginning to relax now that the immediate danger had passed. He glanced up as I approached, offering a tired, grateful nod. I asked him how he had known the raiders would retreat rather than press their attack further. "They came expecting an easy target," he said. "The moment we proved we were not, the math changed for them. Creatures like that do not fight for principle. They fight for advantage. Take away the advantage, and they leave." I told him I finally understood what he meant earlier, about humans not enjoying violence, about fighting only when refusing to fight would cost them something, or someone they were unwilling to lose. He nodded slowly, his expression serious. "That is the part the old stories always leave out," he said. "We do not go looking for fights. We simply refuse to run from the ones that find us, especially when running means leaving someone behind." I looked around the bridge, at Mara still monitoring the damaged systems, at Owen resting nearby despite his insistence on staying useful, at Grace moving quietly toward the medical bay to check on the crew member we had rescued together. Every single one of them had faced genuine danger only minutes earlier, and every single one of them had done so not out of aggression, but out of quiet, unwavering commitment to protecting each other. I realized, standing there on that damaged bridge, that everything I had been taught about humans throughout my entire life had been built from fear rather than understanding. The legends had gotten one part right. Humans, when threatened, when their people or their principles were at risk, became something formidable, something the old records had every reason to respect. What the legends had gotten wrong was assuming that formidable meant monstrous. What I had witnessed instead was something far more complicated and far more remarkable than any nursery tale had ever prepared me for. The hours following the attack passed in a blur of quiet repairs and careful recovery. The rescued crew member, a young man named Peter, sustained only minor injuries thanks to Grace's quick response, and by the time the sun cycle aboard the freighter shifted toward its scheduled rest period, the entire crew had gathered once more in the mess hall, this time with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet relief settling over the room. Threll contacted me shortly after, his voice tense with concern, as he requested a full report on the incident. I gave him the details as clearly as I could, describing the raider attack, the freighter's defense, and the eventual retreat of the hostile ships. He listened carefully, and when I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You are certain the humans acted defensively?" he asked finally. I told him yes, without hesitation. I explained that Daniel had deliberately kept weapons offline until the last possible moment, that every action taken by the crew had been focused on disabling rather than destroying, that the entire encounter had been handled with a level of restraint I had not expected, even after everything I had already witnessed. Threll considered this for a long moment before responding. "This does not match the accounts in our records," he said, his voice carrying genuine confusion rather than doubt. I told him I understood his confusion, because I had felt the same confusion myself only a day earlier. I told him the records we had inherited were incomplete, built from fear rather than understanding, shaped by a war that had wounded both sides so deeply that neither had ever taken the time afterward to understand the other. He asked me what I recommended. I told him I believed the Concord needed to reconsider everything it thought it knew about humans, not because they were harmless, I explained, but because their strength came from something the old stories never captured: loyalty, restraint, a willingness to protect what mattered to them without seeking violence for its own sake. Threll promised to bring my report before the High Assembly, though he warned me that changing centuries of ingrained fear would not happen quickly or easily. I told him I understood, and that I was willing to help however I could. After ending the call, I returned to the mess hall, where I found Daniel sitting alone, staring quietly at a small data display showing the ship's damage report. He looked up as I approached, offering a tired but genuine smile. "How is your report going?" he asked. I told him about my conversation with Threll, about the confusion my report had caused, about the long road ahead if the Concord ever hoped to truly understand his people. He listened carefully, nodding slowly as I spoke. "Change like that takes time," he said. "It took generations for the fear between our peoples to grow this deep. It will likely take just as long to fully unravel it." I asked him if he believed it was possible at all, given everything that had happened between our species. He considered the question seriously before answering. "I do," he said, "because you came here expecting monsters, and instead you stayed to help save lives. That is not nothing. That is exactly how understanding begins." I sat with him in comfortable silence for a while, watching the quiet activity of the crew around us as they moved through the final stages of repair, their earlier exhaustion replaced by a steady, hopeful energy, now that the danger had passed. Mara worked nearby, coaxing the last of the engine systems back to full function. Grace moved between crew members, checking on recovering injuries with the same careful attention she had shown since the moment I arrived. Owen, finally allowed to rest properly, sat quietly near a viewport, watching the stars with the same look of quiet wonder I had seen on Peter's face earlier that day. I realized, watching them, that I no longer saw strangers, or monsters, or even simply humans in the abstract sense the old stories had taught me. I saw individuals, each carrying their own fears and hopes and quiet strength, bound together not by aggression, but by a shared commitment to protecting one another no matter the cost. Before my shuttle departed to return to my own ship, Daniel walked me to the airlock personally. He extended his hand toward me, a human gesture I recognized from old records as a sign of respect and trust between equals. I took his hand carefully, mimicking the gesture as best I could, and felt something settle deeply within me as our hands met. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt like the closing of a distance that had existed between our two peoples for far longer than either of us had been alive. "Thank you for trusting us," he said, "both with your help and with the truth." I told him thank you for showing me that truth in the first place. I told him I intended to spend the rest of my career working to help my people understand what I now understood, that the old stories, though born from real pain and real loss, had never captured the full picture of who his people truly were. He smiled at that, a warm, genuine expression that carried none of the weariness of the battle we had survived together only hours earlier. "Maybe someday the stories will change," he said. I told him I intended to make sure they did. As my shuttle pulled away from the freighter, I watched through the viewport as the damaged but steady ship grew smaller in the distance, its lights glowing warmly against the endless black of space. I thought about my grandmother's stories, about the fear that had shaped my entire understanding of humans since before I could properly walk. I thought about how easily that fear had crumbled the moment I chose to see past it, to look for understanding instead of confirmation of what I already believed. When I returned to my own ship, Threll met me personally at the airlock, his expression a mixture of curiosity and lingering caution. He asked me, quietly, whether I believed the quarantine line should remain in place. I told him I did not know the full answer to that question. Not yet. I told him that trust, once broken as deeply as it had been between our two peoples, could not be rebuilt overnight, no matter how much understanding had grown between myself and the crew of that freighter. But I also told him that I believed, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that rebuilding it was possible. Over the following months, I dedicated myself entirely to compiling everything I had witnessed into a report thorough enough to challenge generations of inherited fear. I detailed the calm efficiency of the crew's medical care, the deliberate restraint shown during the raider attack, the quiet loyalty that bound every member of that freighter together despite exhaustion, injury, and genuine danger. I included Daniel's own words, his explanation of the old war, his insistence that humans fought not out of love for violence, but out of refusal to abandon those they cared about. The report caused significant debate within the High Assembly, exactly as Threll had warned me it would. Some dismissed it entirely, unwilling to reconsider beliefs held for so many generations. Others, slowly and cautiously, began to ask the same questions I had once asked myself. If the stories about humans had been incomplete, what else about the old war might we have misunderstood? I do not know how long it will take for that question to fully unravel the fear my people have carried for so long. I do not know whether the quarantine line will ever fully come down, or whether trust between our two peoples can ever be rebuilt as completely as it once existed before that terrible war centuries ago. What I do know is this: I once believed, without question, that humans were monsters. Exactly as every story from my childhood insisted. I have since learned that the truth was always more complicated, more painful, and ultimately more remarkable than any simple story could ever capture. Humans do not fight because they crave violence. They fight because they refuse to let go of the people and the things they love, even when logic, even when survival itself, argues for retreat. That kind of devotion frightened my people once, deeply enough to draw a line across the galaxy and swear never to cross it again. I no longer believe that fear was ever truly justified. I believe, instead, that it was simply misunderstood, born from a wound neither side ever took the time to properly heal. Someday, I hope the children of my people will grow up hearing a different story about humans. Not a story of monsters lurking beyond a forbidden line, but a story of a species capable of extraordinary gentleness, extraordinary courage, and an unshakable, unwavering loyalty to anyone lucky enough to call them family or friend. or simply someone worth protecting. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that story gets told. Because I learned, in the quiet corridors of a damaged freighter far beyond the edge of everything familiar to me, that the old legends were true after all. Humans were exactly as powerful, exactly as unstoppable, and exactly as devoted as the stories always claimed. The only thing the stories ever got wrong was calling that devotion a monster, when it was, all along, simply love refusing to surrender.